Today we're going to try to unpack one of the most confusing and at the same time most popular spiritual constructs: karma, dharma, the wheel of reincarnation, and the famous idea that Earth is supposedly a school for souls. And if we continue with that metaphor, I'd really like to understand, what kind of school is this where no one remembers the schedule, the subjects, or even their previous attempts to pass the exam?
As well as one can feel inside this strange theater that for some reason people insist on calling normal reality. Honestly, over the past few weeks I've been watching what's happening with a rather heavy feeling. Not because anything surprised me, there's nothing left here to be surprised about. It's something else that's disappointing. How desperately people are still looking for a savior. Political, religious, esoteric, it doesn't matter which one. As long as someone shows up and takes responsibility for their lives. And for me, that's probably the most troubling indicator, because it doesn't just show how flawed the systems are, it shows how little people have stepped into a state of inner sovereignty. I actually like the word sovereignty much more than spirituality these days, because spirituality has been turned into such a sweet, sticky, decorative mixture that it's almost lost its meaning. Sovereignty, on the other hand, is very simple. It's the ability to take responsibility for yourself, to recognize deception, to not look for a shepherd, to not outsource your inner center to something outside of you. Because both in the physical world and in the so-called spiritual domain, there are far too many systems, teachings, and figures that look like saviors but function as traps. That's why I say, this isn't just a matrix, it's matrix, a space built on tricks. A lot of what's here is based on deception that is first presented as comfort.
So, you think the main issue isn't that people are being deceived, but that they actually want to be deceived?
Exactly. Because deception that aligns with an inner need is the most stable kind. If someone wants to be saved, they will be sold a savior. If someone wants their suffering to have a higher meaning, they'll be sold a beautiful philosophy of suffering. If someone wants to believe that all this chaos is actually a carefully designed learning process, they'll be sold Earth as a school. And that brings us to karma. What always fascinates me is how easily people accept an idea just because it's ancient, as if age automatically equals truth. But if we really look at it, humanity has spent thousands of years in fear, violence, war, pain, inequality, cruelty, and loss. And all this time, these same old concepts have existed alongside it. Karma, lessons, purification, destiny, spiritual growth. So a very simple question arises. If these ideas were truly the key to liberation, why does humanity still look like a patient whose room sign keeps getting changed, but who is never actually treated?
So let's be direct. What is karma in your view in the way it's presented today?
In its popular form, karma is a brilliantly constructed mechanism for shifting blame. The system isn't broken, you are. The conditions aren't insane, you just didn't learn your lesson. The world isn't cruel, you signed a contract. Reality isn't absurd, you simply failed to evolve. It's a very convenient framework. It removes questions about the structure of the world and redirects them inward. Instead of asking, why is there so much injustice here, people are encouraged to ask, what's wrong with me that I'm experiencing this? And it's a brilliant move, almost legal in its structure. You're told you have a debt, but you're never shown the statement. You're told it's from a past life, but your memory is erased. You're told you agreed to it, but you don't remember agreeing. You're told to return and fix it, but the rules remain unclear and the criteria for passing are unknown. This isn't cosmic accounting. It's accounting where the client is never allowed to see the balance.
But supporters of karma often say that suffering is never random, that everything has a cause.
Yes, and that sounds elegant right up until it meets reality. Because the moment you look at real human lives, that entire structure begins to crack. A child is born with a severe illness. A peaceful person dies in an accident. Someone sacrifices themselves for others and meets a brutal end, while someone else lies, exploits, harms others, and thrives. And then the explanations begin. It's from a past life. The soul chose this experience. It was part of the contract. It's necessary for growth. Higher consciousness learns through suffering. The question remains unresolved. Why is it that, in the study of this phenomenon, the same patterns inevitably emerge? Again and again, the narrative circles back to torture, mutilation, and prolonged suffering. Not as isolated incidents, but as something deeply embedded, almost intrinsic to the phenomenon itself. Is it a reflection of human perception, a distortion of the mind under pressure, or is there something more deliberate at work? Something that understands pain and uses it with precision. For now, the question remains open.
The roar, and it was kicking up these hot coals and rocks, and the demons would come and they would drag the people with these hot coals and rocks, and they was stomping in their face, and it was just you could hear the muffle, and it was just they would just melt their whole face off. The torture there feeds these demons. So the more grotesque they can torture you, the more power that they get. They get food off of it. They get high off torturing. They get high off your misery and pain there. That is their food. So they get very creative in torturing you, and it is no negotiation. I hear a lot of please stop. I hear a lot of regret. I hear a lot of it's just the noise. The noise is never stopped, nonstop, and it just screams and screams and screams. And people, and they are laughing. These demons are laughing and having fun. They are having fun. And another thing that I kept hearing, see, they speak in a different language, but it hurts your soul. When they speak to each other, it's a different, but you can interpret it. Don't matter what race or what language that you speak. But when they speak to each other and they're laughing, you can clearly hear and understand what they're saying. And a lot of them were laughing and just calling us stupid. They were laughing and calling us stupid, naive, ignorant, basic. Like they would the name that they call us, but it was in their language, but you can still understand it. But when they speak, it hurts you. It feels, you can feel the pain. They literally thrive off of us. That is their food. We are their food. Why you think, it reminds me of people, and that's why the Lord says he doesn't hate the sinner, but he hates the sin. Have you ever been feeling good one day? Feeling full of, you wake up, you're full of life and just promise and that ambitious that day, but you go hang around someone's house or go to someone's home. By the time you leave there, you're just drained. Your ambition's gone, your joy is gone, because they sucked your energy. They sucked your energy out. And 9 times out of 10, it's one of their demons they have around them that sucked your energy out. That's their food. Your happiness, that is life, your life force. They need that.
Then I blinked to another environment where I was like above the blown up truck, and I could see it down on the desert. I could see it as a solid truck, and each of us in it, there were 4 of us in it, each as people, but I could also see the whole thing as kind of energy, organizations of energy. And I was with 2 other beings here. One was like an old friend of mine, and we were really goofing around. We were playing around with my injuries. So we were giving me different injuries, and then we would see like this little hologram of the rest of my life, which we thought was hilarious. Like, chop off her arm and see what put some shrapnel in her brain, and it's not funny now, but it was hilarious then. We just thought we were really funny, and eventually just chose the injuries that I wanted or needed for the experiences that I wanted. Or the whole self certainly made use of that. Maybe I created that, going to a war zone. But when I was out of my body and playing with the injuries, giving myself different injuries, and putting a piece of shrapnel in my head and laughing about what that would look like for the rest of my life, or severing my right arm and finding the rest of that life pretty funny. That's not funny to me from the human perspective. I don't think that the whole self judges. We have a lot of judgments on what experiences are good and what experiences are bad.
And at that point, I always want to ask, do you actually hear what you're saying? Because if you can calmly explain a child's suffering as a necessary spiritual lesson, then maybe the problem is no longer metaphysical. Maybe the problem is that you've found a philosophy that allows you to bypass empathy.
So, the idea of karma can become a way to avoid reality?
Absolutely. It's a psychological elevator. It lifts you above horror without requiring you to actually face it. You don't have to call evil what it is. You don't have to feel anger. You don't have to intervene. You don't have to admit that something is deeply wrong. You can just wrap it in a ribbon and say, it must be as it should be. It looks like wisdom on the surface, but very often, it's just fear of seeing clearly.
And what about dharma? If karma is about consequences, dharma is usually described as the right path, right action. Where is the balance?
Exactly. If we're sold a dual system, karma and dharma, good and bad, balance and symmetry, then where is the symmetry? Why is the focus almost always on debt, guilt, and correction? If someone has done a great deal of good, why doesn't the system acknowledge it with the same enthusiasm it uses to assign punishment? I've seen kind, generous, compassionate people struggle deeply, and I've seen ruthless, manipulative individuals succeed effortlessly. If this is a school, it has a very strange grading system, and at some point an uncomfortable thought appears. Maybe the system isn't designed to cultivate goodness. Maybe it rewards adaptability, hardness, emotional detachment, and the willingness to step over others.
So, almost an inverted ethics.
Yes, inversion. A kind person often becomes vulnerable. A harsh person often gains advantage. Compassion is mistaken for weakness. Mercy is taken as permission. Honesty is not consistently rewarded, while aggression and manipulation often act as accelerators. That doesn't make goodness meaningless. It just means the environment itself doesn't appear neutral or fair.
And that brings us to the idea of Earth as a school. Why does that bother you so much?
Because it's one of the most carelessly accepted metaphors out there. Let's define what a school actually is. In a school, you learn material. You remember previous lessons. You understand what is expected of you. You receive feedback. You can retake a test knowing your mistakes. And ultimately, you can leave. Now compare that to the human experience. You're told you came to learn, but your memory is erased. The rules are unclear. The goals are vague. Evaluation is opaque. You only understand mistakes after the fact, or not at all. Previous attempts are inaccessible, and leaving is not an option until the cycle is complete. That's not a school. That's an exam taken in a fog after induced amnesia. What exactly is being developed there? The ability to suffer? The ability to guess? The ability to rationalize chaos as a higher plan?
Some would say, the soul remembers, even if the personality doesn't.
That's a very convenient argument. Impossible to verify, but capable of closing any logical gap. If something remembers, but you, as the conscious being going through the experience, don't have access to it, then what exactly are you learning? Learning without conscious integration is questionable. It's like someone else attending the lectures while you take the exam.
And yet people still want to believe that everything has meaning.
Of course. Because chaos is terrifying. It's much easier to believe that everything has a reason, a lesson, a contract, a higher plan. It makes the world feel safer. But the cost of that belief is high. It teaches people to suspect themselves as the cause of every blow. It can diminish empathy. It can turn ideology into something more important than compassion. And it often distracts from the real question. How is this environment actually structured?
So, what would you suggest instead?
Honesty. Not another belief system, not another teacher, not another explanation. Honesty. To admit that much is unclear. To admit that pain is pain and not every pain needs to be reframed as a lesson. To admit that compassion matters more than elegant explanations. And most importantly, to reclaim your inner center. To stop waiting for some external system, religion, ideology, or cosmic law to finally explain everything. Maybe maturity begins not when you've found the perfect explanation, but when you stop giving the world the authority to define your conscience.
So instead of spiritual dependence, you're pointing toward sovereignty?
Exactly. Sovereignty instead of dependency. Awareness instead of dogma. Courage instead of comforting illusion. And maybe even humor. Because sometimes the only sane response to all of this isn't reverent mysticism, but a quiet, tired kind of laughter. Not because nothing matters, but because at times the system is so absurd that you either see it or you keep calling a cage a university.
He said, we need you to go back to your body. And I didn't want to go at all. But I agreed to go back because he asked in such a way that I could not refuse it. And I don't know how to explain that. But then I heard or became aware of another thought from one of the first beings that I interfaced with when I was there. And they said, we will take your memory away from you so that it's easier for you to go back. And I said, no, I don't want my memory taken from me. I will go back under the condition I retain my memory of this whole experience. And it was agreed.
If I went back and if I were to fix the problems, if I were to go through the fears and the challenges, if I were to work my stuff out. Also, there was a karmic retribution. Like I had to pay off a karmic debt, which is something I always question whether karma was real. And yes, absolutely. I had to feel what I did to others. And that was a way for me to learn, not like a punishment, but I had to learn that. If I do learn that, I'm more chances of me doing that to someone else is not going to happen because I actually felt what they would feel. So karma for me was it was more of a tool for my growth. And when I was a young kid, I had such compassion and such good qualities about me. My parents were always so mad because they knew the young me, but then I changed into this horrible person. Now I know like this horrible person was created because of abuse and trauma, but I'm not blaming myself for that. But the abuse, the level of abuse and the trauma and all these things that happened to me, it just made me a version of myself that even I didn't like. But I didn't know how to change out of that, right? It just got worse and worse and worse.
And if we bring all of this down to one point, what is the most absurd part of it? Because the further we go into this, the more it feels like the whole framework simply collapses under its own logic.
Yes, exactly. And for me, the greatest absurdity is that a person is handed a moral and spiritual bill in a system that was set up against them from the very beginning. They're told, you came here to learn, you have to grow, you have to evolve, you have to heal karma, you have to pass your lessons, you have to become purer, wiser, more conscious. Fine, but under what conditions? Under conditions where, from birth, you're thrown into a world of pain, fear, disease, scarcity, psychological trauma, wars, lies, manipulation, social programming, and constant pressure. And if you follow the logic of this model all the way through, then all of this chaos, all of this suffering, all of these cycles are supposedly governed by the very same entities or forces that then meet you after death and ask, so how did you do with your lessons? That is the madness of it. They first create an environment where it is almost impossible not to break, and then pretend they are evaluating you objectively.
So the system itself is demanding the impossible from a human being.
Exactly. And it's not just difficult, It's fundamentally unfair by design. Imagine an exam where, first your memory is erased, then the rules are not explained, then you're placed into noise, chaos, fear, and constant blows. Then you're distracted, traumatized, intimidated, and thrown off balance. And at the very end they say, well, the result is weak. Apparently you didn't grow enough. It's absurd. It's like being made to sit the most important exam of your life after all your study material has been wiped, and then being locked inside a burning building where the ceiling is collapsing. People are screaming, everyone is running, someone is hitting you over the head, and when you finally stagger out, a stern committee looks at you and says, unfortunately, you did not demonstrate sufficient maturity. Well, of course you didn't. You created the conditions to make that almost impossible.
And on top of that, the person is told they chose it.
Yes, and that's another layer of absurdity. They're told, you chose this life yourself. You signed the contract yourself. You agreed to these lessons yourself. You took on this karma yourself. But you don't remember any of it. That is the perfect contract for a scam artist. The signature supposedly exists. The obligations are enormous. The memory is erased, and no copy of the agreement is ever provided. And that becomes the foundation of the entire guilt structure. If you suffer, you deserved it. If you were born sick, you're working something off. If you lost loved ones, it's a lesson. If you were broken, it was necessary for your growth. If you didn't cope, you lack consciousness. If you protest, it only means you haven't risen above duality yet. So whatever happens, the system already has an answer ready. It is always right. The human being is always at fault.
Let's go straight to examples because that's where it becomes especially obvious.
Yes, with examples it becomes unbearably clear. Take, for instance, a child with a severe incurable illness. A small child, maybe 10 years old, with a terminal diagnosis. And there are people who say, this soul chose that experience, or it's his karma, or even worse, God needed to live through that experience. But if God is all-knowing, why would God need to learn through a child's cancer? And if it's the child's karma, then what kind of system is this, where a being remembers nothing and is then forced to pay with its body and pain for something it has no access to? Or take another example, children in war zones, bombings, torn off limbs, their parents dying in front of them, hunger, fear, shock. And someone sits in comfort and says, it's a lesson for the soul. What lesson? What exactly is being studied there? How to scream properly under rubble? How to grow spiritually while your family is being killed in front of you? That is no longer metaphysics. That's an attempt to cover horror with a beautiful phrase. Or let's take the opposite kind of example. A person risks themselves for others, saves people, helps them, pulls children and the elderly out of danger, and then dies an absurd death, falling into some manhole on the way to save the next person. Where is Dharma there? Where is the reward for goodness? Where is the balance? If we are constantly told that the universe is morally symmetrical, then why does good so often not merely go unrewarded, but end even more brutally? And now look at those who lie, steal, poison, destroy lives, start wars, profit from suffering, harm thousands, sometimes millions, and very often they live wonderfully. Wealth, power, protection, comfort, long life, banquet after banquet. So where is karma? Where is the immediate cosmic balance?
The voice was saying to me, I know you. I have always known you. You are my creature. I made you. I make you. I love you as you are.
And I remember looking to my left and it was Jesus standing there. And I thought, I just knew it as though I remembered him. And I said to him, oh my God, you really do exist. I couldn't believe. And he smiled and opened up his arms, and he was basically inviting me to come and give him a hug. So I did. And then he turned me with him to walk with him, and he said, come on, we have a lot of work to do. He took me to go meet my other guides, Archangel Michael, Mother Mary, El Moria, and Saint Germain. And we stepped inside this golden capsule where there was it's like a TV screen, but there were no cords. Everything was just, there was no electrical outlet. I don't remember seeing anything like that. But I remember my entire life played out in front of me from the moment of my conception. And every experience that I had in my life, I had to live again. Not only did I hear my thoughts and feel my fears or happiness or illness or disappointment or resentment, I had to hear the other person and what they were thinking in those moments. And so that was very difficult, where I had been sexually abused as a child. I'd had a really horrible fatal car accident, which was my first NDE, as a matter of fact. I had to look at all of this again. I had to watch my best friend and her mother die. I was in their car. I had to live all of that pain again. So I remember this experience being, it was almost like, it's the way that I can describe it is, it's like heaven's therapy session with you as you go through it, because they'll pause. However they paused it was, they stopped it and they watched me go through the emotions and experience and feel everything. And they loved me through it. They were just my rocks in that moment. And I am so, so grateful. So they allowed me to just reveal.
They clearly had a commanding presence, and I felt very honored to be in front of them. And we had finished some kind of tour of the cosmos, or some kind of communication download, or I'd seen something. I'd seen a lot, but there was an agreement being made, and that's why I was standing in front of them. The agreement was, you won't remember anything you've seen, or you'll never shut up about it. The second part of the agreement was, you have to do the work.
Just absorbing everything that's around me, but I'm also having a lot of, aha, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And it was like I was becoming super smart. You know, I was remembering everything that my original state remembers, and realizing how much I had to dumb myself down for the experience of being human. You're literally leaving this divine, omnipotent, eternal presence that you are, and stuffing yourself into this little meat suit and giving yourself 5 senses as a consolation prize, and getting the amnesia that doesn't allow you to remember,
Why do some people begin life in horror while others flourish despite being obviously destructive? If the system is truly morally precise, why does it look so chaotic and crooked?
And it ends up looking as though karma works in a very strange way, almost only in one direction.
That is another major absurdity. If suffering is explained through karma, then logically you would expect goodness to be explained just as clearly through dharma, as in, you helped, you supported, you saved, you showed courage, kindness, compassion, and here is the corresponding result. But somehow the emphasis is always on debt, guilt, error, and repayment. You hurt someone in a past life, back into the grinder you go. You looked the wrong way, acted the wrong way, lived the wrong way, back you go. But where is the clear part about a person having accumulated goodness? Why does the accounting in this school seem to be set up almost entirely around penalties? It's as if the universe's bookkeeping works only on the debit side, while the credit side is permanently frozen.
And on top of that comes the idea that this is a school at all.
Yes, and to me that is one of the most ridiculous metaphors of all, because a school implies several things. You remember the material, you understand the subject, you know what is expected of you, you can learn from your mistakes, you can retake the test knowing where you went wrong, and finally you can leave. But what do we have here? Memory erased, rules vague, goals unclear, feedback either absent or delivered in the form of suffering whose meaning you cannot verify, previous lives inaccessible, and you cannot leave. You're told, play it out until the end. What kind of school is that? In what school does a student sit an exam remembering none of the lectures? In what school is failure explained as entirely your fault when they gave you amnesia before the test? That is no longer a school. It is a system that calls itself a school so that its cruelty can appear noble.
And if we continue following that logic, then the very entities that judge a person later may also be the ones sustaining this whole machinery of pain.
Exactly, and that is the darkest part of the entire framework. If you accept their own logic, then the picture looks like this. There are certain forces or entities that govern this space, maintain the cycle, permit or organize wars, hunger, fear, catastrophes, energetic exhaustion, and constant traumatization. They need the energy of suffering, low states, shock, horror, and loss. And it is into exactly that kind of environment that a person is sent again and again. And then, when they leave the body, they are told, "So why were you so angry? Why didn't you pass the lesson of love? Why did you accumulate so much karma? Why didn't you do better?" Well, hold on. If you built this hell, if you created the field in which people are broken from childhood, if you erased their memory, if you hid the rules of the game from them, then by what right do you ask them for anything at all? It's like a prison guard setting a fire in a cell, locking the door, taking away the prisoner's map, water, memory, and shoes, and then, when the prisoner crawls out burned and shattered, saying, "To be honest, you demonstrated a rather poor level of self-discipline."
So, the person is effectively guilty simply for having ended up inside it.
Yes, that is exactly what it looks like. In a system like that, participation itself makes you suspect. You are born, you already owe. You suffer, you chose it. You are outraged, you're unspiritual. You break down, you didn't do enough work. You doubt the system, you just haven't yet understood its wisdom. It is a perfect closed construction, because it never allows for the possibility that the problem lies in the architecture itself, only in the human being. And that is why, in my view, the very first thing a person has to do is stop automatically agreeing with the accusation. Stop instantly taking the blame upon yourself for a world that may have been designed from the outset as a machine of disorientation, suffering, and substitution. Because the moment you accept their framing without question, you have already lost. You are already playing their game by their rules. You are already agreeing that the exam is fair, even though your memory was erased and the classroom was set on fire. But if you start seeing the absurdity, if you begin asking not what is wrong with me, but what is wrong with the system itself, then perhaps that is where the first real chance appears to step out of the hypnosis of the whole structure.
Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and we will see you in the next episode.